Gabrielle clutched her notebook to her chest as she stepped into the classroom, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Rows of desks were already half filled with people chatting quietly, their voices mixing with the low hum of a coffee machine in the corner. She hesitated just inside the door, her stomach twisting in knots. Her nerves had been building all afternoon, spiraling into a jittery storm that made her palms sweat. But this was it, her first real step toward the daycare she dreamed of for years. She took a steadying breath and scanned the room for an open seat. In the back, a man sat slouched, his long legs stretched out in front of him and crossed at the ankles. He had on a leather jacket, slightly scuffed at the elbows, and his dark hair was tousled in a way that seemed both intentional and careless. He was scrolling through his phone, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he were in on a private joke. Gabrielle quickly looked away and made her way to a seat closer to the front, tucking her bag under the desk and flipping open her notebook. The instructor, a brisk woman in a tailored blazer, strode in and launched into introductions. Gabrielle barely heard a word, her mind racing with the possibility of failure. What if she didn't belong here? What if her idea wasn't good enough? She forced herself to jot down notes, her pen scratching nervously across the page. "All right," the instructor said, clapping her hands together. "This course is about collaboration, as much as it's about entrepreneurship. You'll be working in pairs on a business proposal. I've already assigned the groups." Gabrielle's pulse quickened. She wasn't good at working with people, especially strangers. The instructor began reading out names, pairing students one by one. Gabrielle tapped her pen against her notebook, each name that wasn't hers ratcheting her nerves higher. And finally, Gabrielle Hayes and Lucas Carter. Gabrielle turned automatically, her eyes landing on the man in the back row. He looked up from his phone, his dark eyes locking with hers for a split second before he stood, giving her a small, lopsided smile. He didn't look like the kind of person who took a night class on business. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a rock album, or maybe a motorcycle ad. She quickly looked back at her notebook to avoid staring. As the class broke into murmurs, Lucas sauntered over, pulling out the chair next to her and sinking into it. His presence filled the small space between them, the scent of leather and something faintly citrusy catching her off guard. "So," he said, his voice smooth but edged with a teasing lilt, "guess we're stuck with each other." "Gabrielle, right?" She nodded, gripping her pen like a lifeline. "Yeah. And you're Lucas?" "That's me." He grinned, leaning back in his chair. "So what's your big idea? World domination? Replacing Starbucks?" She laughed nervously, feeling her cheeks flush. "Nothing like that. I want to open a daycare." The words felt fragile in her mouth, like they might break if he didn't take them seriously. Lucas tilted his head, studying her. "A daycare, huh? That's actually pretty cool. I mean, kids are terrifying, but someone's got to do it." She blinked at him, surprised. "You think so?" "Yeah," he said with a shrug. "It's honest. Important, too. Way better than some app no one needs." His casual sincerity caught her off guard, and for the first time that evening, she felt a small flicker of confidence. Maybe this partnership wouldn't be so bad after all. The little bell above the café door jingled as Gabrielle stepped inside, clutching her laptop bag tightly. The warm scent of espresso and baked goods wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, chasing away the chill of the autumn evening. She paused just inside the threshold, taking in the café's charm, a converted train depot with high ceilings and vintage decor. Old black and white photos of locomotives lined the exposed brick walls, and iron beams arched overhead like the skeleton of a bygone era. Soft jazz hummed from a hidden speaker, mingling with the low murmur of conversation. Lucas was already there, sitting at a small table toward the back near an old, repurposed ticket counter. He had his leather jacket draped over the back of his chair, and he was nursing a cup of coffee while absently doodling on a napkin with a black pen. His head was bent, dark hair falling into his eyes, and a faint crease marked his brow. The scene was so incongruous, this bad boy type sitting quietly in an artsy cafe, that Gabrielle almost smiled. She took a deep breath and approached the table. "Hey," she said softly. Lucas glanced up, and the crease in his brow smoothed out as he grinned. "Hey, yourself. I was starting to think you'd bailed. Sorry, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. I got caught up talking to a parent at work. One of the kids I watch is having a hard time adjusting to preschool. Sounds tough, Lucas said, setting his pen down. You're like a babysitter, right? Gabrielle hesitated, then corrected him. More like a nanny, but yeah, kind of. Bet that's pretty unpredictable, he said, his grin widening. Kids are like tiny drunk adults, right? You never know what they're going to do next. She laughed, surprised by the analogy. Something like that. Lucas leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. So, since we're supposed to be making a business plan for your dream daycare, how do we start? Is it going to have a cool name? Like, I don't know, Little Rebels Academy? Gabrielle laughed again, the sound bubbling up before she could stop it. Definitely not that. I want it to feel warm and welcoming, you know? Like a second home for the kids. Second home, Lucas mused, tapping his finger against the table. That's not bad. Simple. Honest. She blinked at him, surprised. I hadn't thought of that. Well, there's your first freebie, he teased, picking up his coffee and taking a long sip. What else you got? Tell me about the dream. Gabrielle hesitated. She wasn't used to talking about herself, much less something as personal as her ambitions, but Lucas's gaze was steady, curious, but not pushy, and for some reason it put her at ease. I've always loved working with kids, she began. I guess it started with my little brother. He's 10 years younger than me, so I helped take care of him a lot growing up. And I've been saving up for years to open my own daycare. It feels so far away sometimes, you know? Lucas nodded thoughtfully. I get that. Big dreams can feel like they're sitting on the other side of a mountain. But hey, you're here, right? Taking a class, making a plan. That's more than most people do. His words warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. What about you? She asked, shifting the focus. What made you take this class? He shrugged, his expression turning a little wry. Honestly, I needed a change. I've been doing the same thing for years, coding for some big tech firm, cranking out features that no one cares about. It's not bad work, but it's predictable, boring. I wanted to shake things up. Gabrielle tilted her head, intrigued. So you don't like predictability? Not really, Lucas admitted. I mean, sure, I like knowing my paycheck will show up on time, but beyond that, life's supposed to surprise you, right? Otherwise, what's the point? She considered this for a moment, her finger tracing the edge of her coffee cup. I think I'm the opposite. I like stability. Predictability is comforting for me, like a safety net. Lucas smiled, though it wasn't mocking. If anything, it was understanding. Maybe that's why we're good partners. You'll keep us organized, and I'll make sure we don't fall asleep along the way. Gabrielle laughed softly. Maybe. Their conversation shifted back to the project, and as they brainstormed ideas, Gabrielle found herself relaxing more and more. Lucas had an easy way of talking, his humor balancing out her seriousness. He didn't make her feel small or silly for her ideas. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and offering suggestions that were surprisingly thoughtful. As the evening wore on, the café emptied out, leaving the two of them in a quiet corner surrounded by the faint hiss of the espresso machine and the occasional clatter of dishes. Gabrielle realized with a start that she was actually enjoying herself, not just the work, but the company. And when Lucas paused mid-sentence to flash her one of his crooked smiles, something warm unfurled in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, unpredictability wasn't such a bad thing after all. The cafe was quieter than usual when Gabrielle walked in, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a soft chime. Outside, dusk was settling heavily over the town, painting the windows in muted shades of violet and gray. Inside, the warm glow of hanging Edison bulbs reflected off the polished wood tables, and the faint smell of cinnamon lingered in the air. Gabrielle's eyes found Lucas immediately. He was sitting in their usual corner, one hand idly spinning his coffee cup, while the other scrawled something across a notebook page. She hesitated for a moment, watching him. His leather jacket was draped over the back of his chair, and his dark hair looked even messier than usual, like he'd been running his hands through it in frustration. There was something about the slight furrow in his brow, the way he bit the end of his pen cap, that made him seem less untouchable, less like the confident, teasing guy she was getting used to, and more like someone like her. Someone who didn't have all the answers. "Hey," she said softly as she approached, sliding her bag onto the floor beside her chair. Lucas looked up and blinked, the tension in his face easing as he smiled. "Hey, yourself. Thought you were going to stand me up." "I'm not that late," she said, pulling off her coat and draping it over the back of her chair. "Late enough," he teased. "I've already written us an entire business plan. It's genius, by the way. We're calling it Little Rebels Academy." Gabrielle groaned, but the laugh bubbled up before she could stop it. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "Not a chance," he said, leaning back in his chair with a grin. "But seriously, how was your day? Any tiny drunk adults give you grief?" She smiled, shaking her head. "Not too bad today. One of the kids I watch is going through a biting phase, but no casualties so far. I'll call that a win." "Yikes. Sounds intense," he tilted his head, his gaze softening. "You really like it, though, don't you? Working with kids." "I do," she admitted, a small, shy smile tugging at her lips. "It's not always easy, but I don't know. I guess it feels like what I'm meant to do, you know?" Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So, the daycare thing, that's the dream, right?" She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. It wasn't the first time someone had asked her that, but it felt different coming from him. Like he actually wanted to know, not just make small talk. "Yeah," she said finally. "It's something I've been working toward for a long time. Ever since I was a kid, really. My little brother, he's 10 years younger than me. He was kind of like my first job, I guess. I helped take care of him a lot growing up. And then after high school, I started nannying. I love it, being part of these little lives, helping them feel safe and loved. It's hard to describe, but it's everything to me." Lucas was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to fidget. But when he spoke, his voice was soft. "That's amazing, Gabrielle. Seriously. Most people don't even know what they want, let alone work this hard for it." She felt her cheeks flush. "It doesn't always feel amazing. It feels impossible sometimes. Like I'm climbing this huge mountain and I don't even know if I'll ever make it to the top." "Yeah," he said, his voice almost a murmur. "I know what you mean." She looked at him surprised. "You do?" He gave her a lopsided smile, but there was no teasing in it this time. "Yeah, I mean, it's different, obviously, but I've been stuck in this rut for years. Writing code for these big tech companies, working on projects that don't mean anything to me. It's good money, sure, but it's so empty. I don't even know why I started anymore. I used to think I'd build something that mattered, something that made people's lives better. But now..." He trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window. Gabrielle watched him, her chest tightening. She wasn't used to seeing him like this, unguarded, his usual wit and bravado stripped away. It made her heart ache in a way she didn't entirely understand. "That's why you're in this class, isn't it?" she asked gently, "to figure out what comes next." He nodded, his eyes flicking back to hers. "Pretty much. I guess I want something more, something that feels like it matters. But I don't even know where to start. It's like every time I think about making a change, I just freeze." She hesitated, then reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of his notebook. "You're starting now, though. You're here. That's something." Lucas studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You're pretty good at this, you know." "Good at what?" "At making people feel like they're not completely screwing up their lives." She laughed, the sound light and unexpected. "I don't know about that, but I do know what it's like to feel stuck. And I think you're doing better than you think." His crooked smile returned, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, humming with something unspoken. Gabrielle's heart thudded painfully as she looked away, breaking the spell. "So," she said quickly, reaching for her laptop, "we should probably get back to the project." "Right," Lucas said, leaning back in his chair, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he picked up his pen again. As they dove back into brainstorming, Gabrielle felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest. It wasn't just her dream she was working toward anymore, it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, the mountain didn't feel quite so insurmountable. The café buzzed softly around them, the clinking of cups and low hum of conversations settling into the background like a cozy blanket. Gabrielle leaned over the table, her elbows propped up as she studied the diagram Lucas had sketched onto a napkin. His handwriting was messy, more scrawl than script, but she could make out the basic shapes of his idea. "So," he said, pointing at the crooked rectangle he'd labeled play area, "I'm thinking this space is where the kids can burn off steam. We'll add some beanbags, maybe a mini climbing wall if we want to get fancy." Gabrielle raised an eyebrow, biting back a smile. "A climbing wall? For toddlers?" "Why not?" Lucas grinned, leaning back in his chair like he'd just made the most ingenious suggestion. "Start 'em young, build their upper body strength. They'll be the toughest kids on the playground." She couldn't help it. She laughed, shaking her head. "I think you're confusing daycare with a military training camp." "Hey, you never know," he teased, his dark eyes sparkling with mock seriousness. "You've got to prepare these kids for the real world. It's brutal out there." Gabrielle covered her mouth as another laugh escaped, the sound bubbling up uncontrollably. She had never really imagined herself laughing this much with someone like Lucas. He was different, unexpectedly funny, quick-witted, and so unlike the polished, professional types she had always assumed she'd work with someday. "All right," she said, still laughing as she pulled the napkin closer. "Let's dial it back a bit. Maybe a cozy reading nook instead of a climbing wall, with pillows and blankets, something calming." Lucas tilted his head, pretending to consider it. I guess that's fine, if you want to deprive the kids of their chance to become playground legends." She snorted, and he grinned wider, clearly pleased with himself. He tapped his pen against the table, watching her with a look that made her cheeks feel warm. "You've got a good laugh, you know," he said suddenly, his voice softer now. Gabrielle froze, her smile faltering for just a second. "I what?" "I mean it," he said, his tone easy but sincere. "You should do it more often." She didn't know what to say to that. Compliments weren't exactly her forte, especially ones that felt so personal. Thanks," she mumbled, looking down at the napkin to avoid his gaze. Her heart thudded in her chest as she tried to refocus. "So, the reading nook. What do you think?" "Definitely a good call," Lucas said, but his voice had that teasing lilt again. "Though I'm still holding out for my climbing wall." Gabrielle smiled despite herself, glancing up at him. "We'll put it on the maybe someday list." "Deal," he said, leaning forward now, closing the space between them just slightly. His elbow brushed hers, and the faint contact sent a spark skittering up her arm. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the business plan in front of them, but Lucas's presence was impossible to ignore. "So," he said after a pause, his voice dropping just a fraction, "tell me something about you, something I don't know yet." She blinked at him, caught off guard. "Like what?" "Anything," he said with that crooked smile of his. "Something random. Surprise me." Gabrielle hesitated, glancing down at her coffee cup. "I don't know. I guess I've always wanted to travel, but I've never been anywhere outside the state." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Really? Not even for a weekend trip or anything?" She shook her head, feeling a little embarrassed. "Nope. I've always been, I don't know, too busy, too focused on saving money, too scared, maybe." "Scared of what?" She shrugged, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, "of getting lost, of being somewhere unfamiliar, I guess. It just feels overwhelming." Lucas was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady. "You know, getting lost isn't always a bad thing," he said finally. "Sometimes it's the best way to find something new." His words settled over her, warm and surprising, like an unexpected ray of sunlight. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment, the rest of the café faded away. "Maybe," she said softly, her heart thudding in a way that had nothing to do with their project. "Definitely," Lucas replied, his voice low, his eyes locked on hers, and just like that, their meeting didn't feel so professional anymore. The door to Gabrielle's apartment creaked as she pushed it open, the sound breaking the quiet of the hallway. She stepped inside, flipping on the light and setting her bag down by the door. Her movements felt mechanical, her mind still buzzing from the night's meeting at the café. They'd made progress on their project, sure, but it wasn't the business plan that had her heart racing. It was the way Lucas had looked at her tonight. That look had lingered. Unspoken words simmering in the air between them. She could still feel the heat of his gaze, the way his arm brushed hers when they leaned over the table, the faint smell of leather and coffee that clung to him. It was becoming impossible to ignore, this strange electric tension that seemed to grow stronger every time they met. She kicked off her shoes and ran a hand through her hair, heading toward the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. She had just taken a sip when there was a knock at the door. Frowning, she set the glass down and padded back across the small apartment, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. When she opened the door, Lucas was there, his leather jacket thrown over one shoulder, his dark hair slightly disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight, his eyes darker than usual. "Lucas," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure why she was whispering. Maybe it was the way he was looking at her, like he'd crossed some kind of line in his head and wasn't planning to turn back. "Hey," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. "Sorry, I know it's late. I couldn't leave things like that." "Like what?" she asked, her heart starting to pound. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, and then he shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. "Forget it. I shouldn't." "Lucas," she interrupted, stepping closer to the threshold. "What's going on?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, and then he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know we're supposed to be working on this project, and I know this probably isn't a good idea, but I don't know. Before he could finish, she reached out and grabbed his wrist, pulling him inside and shutting the door behind him. She didn't know what possessed her to do it. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, or the way her own body seemed to hum with unspoken desire. All she knew was that she couldn't let him leave without saying the thing she'd been too scared to admit, even to herself. "I can't stop thinking about you either," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And it's driving me crazy." His eyes widened slightly, like he hadn't expected her to say it, but then his expression softened, and something in his stance shifted. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers, and when he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Tell me to leave, and I will." She didn't tell him to leave. Instead, she stepped closer, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she was sure he could hear it. "Don't go," she said, the words barely escaping her lips before he reached for her. The world seemed to tilt as he pulled her to him, his hands moving to cup her face, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent. Gabrielle's hands found their way to his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as she kissed him back, her breath hitching when he deepened the kiss. He tasted faintly of coffee and something sweeter, something distinctly Lucas, and it made her head spin. They stumbled back toward the couch, their movements clumsy and desperate, their lips never parting. Lucas's jacket slipped from his shoulders and landed on the floor, and Gabrielle's cardigan followed soon after. When the backs of her knees hit the edge of the couch, she fell onto the cushions, pulling him down with her. His weight pressed against her, grounding her in a way that felt both overwhelming and utterly right. His hands roamed over her, tentative at first, but growing bolder with every passing second. She shivered as his fingers brushed the sliver of skin where her shirt had ridden up, and she arched into him, her breath catching as he kissed her neck. "Gabrielle," he murmured against her skin, his voice rough and low. Her name on his lips sent a thrill through her, and she threaded her fingers through his hair, pulling him closer. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, rational voice tried to remind her that this was a mistake, that they were supposed to be working together, not whatever this was. But that voice was drowned out by the sound of Lucas's breath mingling with hers. By the way, his hands seemed to know exactly where to touch her, to make her forget everything but him. "Are you sure?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look at her. His eyes searched hers, and she could see the restraint in his expression, the way he was holding himself back for her sake. Instead of answering, she leaned up and kissed him again, her hands slipping under his shirt to feel the warmth of his skin. "I'm sure," she whispered against his lips. And that was all he needed. The rest of the night passed in a blur of heat and tangled limbs, of whispered words and quiet gasps. Gabrielle had never felt so alive, so completely consumed by another person. And when they finally collapsed together, their breathing ragged, their bodies entwined, she realized with startling clarity that there was no going back from this. Whatever they were now, it was something entirely new. And it terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. The café glowed softly in the late afternoon light, the golden rays slanting through the wide windows and pooling across the wooden floor. Gabrielle arrived first this time, settling at their usual table in the corner with her laptop open and a steaming cup of chai tea beside her. She tried to focus on the spreadsheet she'd started for their business plan, but her thoughts kept straying to Lucas. It was impossible to ignore the shift between them since that night at her apartment. The memory of his hands on her skin, his lips on hers, sent a warm shiver through her even now. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up just as Lucas walked in, his leather jacket slung over one shoulder and his hair tousled in that effortless way she was starting to recognize as distinctly him. He spotted her immediately and grinned, his dark eyes lighting up in a way that made her chest tighten. It was a simple thing, the way he looked at her, but it felt like a secret only the two of them shared. "Hey," he said as he reached the table, sliding into the chair across from her. His jacket landed on the back of his seat, and he leaned forward, his elbow propped on the table as he studied her. "You're early. Trying to put me to shame?" She smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I just wanted to get a head start. We still need to finalize the numbers for the budget, and Whoa, Lucas interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let me at least get a coffee before we dive into spreadsheets, all right? I'm not equipped for that kind of math before caffeine." Gabrielle laughed, the sound soft and unguarded. "Fair enough. Go ahead." As he headed to the counter to order, she watched him, unable to help, the way her gaze lingered on the easy confidence in his stride, the way his shoulders moved beneath the worn leather of his jacket. He was so different from anyone she'd ever known, and yet being with him felt right, natural, even. The thought both exhilarated and terrified her. When he returned, coffee in hand, he set it down and slid his chair closer to hers, his knee brushing against hers beneath the table. The casual touch sent a spark through her, and when she glanced up at him, he was smirking, like he knew exactly what he was doing. "All right," he said, leaning toward her and eyeing her laptop screen. "Show me what you've got." She bit her lip, trying to focus, as she pulled up the budget document. "So, I was thinking we could start small, maybe just 2 rooms to begin with, one for infants and one for toddlers. That way we can keep the initial costs down while we build up our client base." Lucas nodded, his brow furrowing in concentration as he scanned the numbers. "Makes sense. And once we're up and running, we can expand, right? Add a playground or, I don't know, that reading nook you're so obsessed with." She laughed, nudging him with her elbow. "It's a good idea and you know it." "Fine, I'll admit it," he said, his grin softening into something more genuine. "You've got good ideas, Gabrielle. This whole plan, it's solid. Better than anything I could have come up with on my own." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, and she ducked her head, pretending to double-check a figure on the spreadsheet. "Thanks. I couldn't have done it without your help, though." "Don't sell yourself short," he said, his voice quieter now. When she looked up, his dark eyes were on her, steady and intent. "This is your dream. I'm just lucky I get to be part of it." The sincerity in his voice made her breath hitch, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. But then his hand brushed hers where it rested on the table, his fingers curling around hers in a light, tentative touch. The cafe around them seemed to fade, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of voices dissolving into the background. "Lucas," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, but he shook his head, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't overthink it." Before she could protest, though, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was warm and unhurried, the kind of kiss that made the world fall away. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she kissed him back, her hand tightening around his. It wasn't the desperate, breathless passion of their first night together. It was something quieter, deeper, and it left her feeling both grounded and untethered all at once. When they finally pulled apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her cheek. "We should probably get back to work," he murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't in any hurry to let her go. "Probably," she agreed, her heart still racing. But even as she turned her attention back to the laptop, her hand stayed in his, their fingers intertwined beneath the table. They worked like that for the next hour, their conversation peppered with teasing remarks and moments of quiet focus. Lucas's touch was a constant presence, a steady reminder of the connection they were building, not just in their work, but in the space between them. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the café began to empty out, Gabrielle realized something. She wasn't afraid of falling anymore. With Lucas, the fall didn't feel so scary. It felt like flying. The café was quieter than usual, the faint hum of conversation barely audible over the soft jazz playing from the speakers. Gabrielle sat at their usual table, wrapping her hands around a mug of chai tea that had long gone cold. She stared out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass in silvery trails. It was a gloomy evening, and not just because of the weather. Something about Lucas's text, "Let's meet at the café. I need to talk to you," had set her on edge all day. She glanced at the door for the 100th time, her chest tightening as she tried to imagine what he might want to say. Was it about the project? It had to be. But the way his words had lingered in her mind, sharp and heavy, made her wonder if it was something else entirely. The bell above the door jingled, and she turned her head sharply, her breath catching when she saw him. Lucas stepped inside, shaking the rain from his leather jacket and running a hand through his damp hair. His expression was unreadable, his usual easy grin replaced by a tightness around his mouth. He spotted her immediately and made his way over, his boots clunking softly against the wooden floor. "Hey," he said as he slid into the seat across from her. His voice was quieter than usual, his tone almost tentative. "Hey," she replied, her own voice equally soft. "You're late." "Sorry," he said, glancing down at the table. "I got caught up at work." Gabrielle studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested on the table, fingers drumming lightly against the wood. This wasn't the Lucas she was used to, the playful, confident guy who always had a teasing remark ready. This Lucas seemed uneasy, nervous even. "What's going on?" she asked, her fingers tightening around her mug. Lucas took a deep breath, his hands stilling against the table. "I got an offer," he said finally, his voice steady but low. "A job offer." Gabrielle blinked, caught off guard. "A job offer? That's great, right? I mean, you've always talked about wanting a change." "Yeah," he said, though his tone lacked the enthusiasm she expected. "It's with a startup out in Seattle. They're offering me a lead developer position, better pay, more creative freedom. It's exactly what I've been looking for." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy. Gabrielle's heart sank slightly, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "Seattle," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's far." "It is," Lucas admitted, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was something in his gaze that made her stomach twist, a mixture of hope and hesitation, like he was bracing himself for her reaction. "But it's an amazing opportunity, Gabrielle. I couldn't not consider it." She nodded slowly, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Of course, it sounds like a big deal." "It is," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But that's not all I wanted to tell you." Her chest tightened again, the unease from earlier swelling back to the surface. "What do you mean?" Lucas hesitated, his fingers drumming against the table once more. "I want you to come with me," he said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "To Seattle. I know it's a big ask, but I don't want to do this without you." Gabrielle froze, her mind reeling. "You want me to leave?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. The wind howled outside Gabrielle's apartment, rattling the windows in their frames. She sat curled up on the couch, her knees tucked to her chest, a blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, the cursor blinking accusingly on the spreadsheet she'd been avoiding for the past hour. Next to it was her phone, its screen dark and silent. She hadn't heard from Lucas since their conversation at the café, and the weight of his absence pressed on her chest like a stone. Across the room, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, but time felt meaningless. She'd been stuck in the same spiral for days now, replaying his words over and over in her mind. I thought we had something worth taking a chance on. The way he'd looked at her when he said it, hopeful, vulnerable, hurt, made her stomach twist every time she thought about it. She couldn't shake the image of him walking out into the rain that night, his shoulders hunched, his leather jacket soaked through. She buried her face in her hands, her breath shaky and uneven. How had everything gotten so complicated? Just weeks ago, her life had been simple, steady. She'd been focused on her dream, chipping away at it piece by piece, doing everything she could to make it a reality. And then Lucas had come crashing into her world with his crooked smiles and bold ideas, turning everything upside down. He'd made her laugh when she didn't expect to, made her feel things she hadn't let herself feel in years. He'd made her believe, for a little while, that maybe unpredictability wasn't so terrifying after all. But now she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. And all Lucas was asking her to do was jump. Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her out of her thoughts. She grabbed it instinctively, her heart leaping in her chest at the hope that it might be him. But it wasn't. It was a text from her sister, asking about plans for their parents' anniversary dinner next weekend. Gabrielle stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone back down, her shoulders slumping. The truth was, she didn't know if Lucas would ever text her again. He'd made it clear what he wanted, and she'd made it just as clear that she couldn't give it to him. She'd chosen her dream, her roots, her stability. But as the days passed and the silence between them grew, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd lost something just as important. The knock at her door was soft but insistent, cutting through the quiet of the apartment. Gabrielle froze, her heart racing as she stared at the door. For a moment she thought about ignoring it, letting whoever it was think she wasn't home. But the knock came again, and something about it felt familiar. Tentative. Like the person standing on the other side wasn't sure they should be there. She unfolded herself from the couch and made her way to the door, her bare feet silent against the hardwood. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to see Lucas standing there. He looked tired, his dark hair mussed like he'd been running his hands through it, and his leather jacket hung limply over one shoulder. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavily in the space between them. "Hey," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Hey," she replied, her own voice barely audible. She stepped aside, letting him in without thinking. He hesitated for a second before stepping over the threshold, the familiar scent of leather and faint cologne washing over her as he passed. The door clicked shut behind him, and Gabrielle turned to face him, her arms wrapping around herself defensively. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Lucas winced slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted. "But I couldn't. I couldn't leave things like this." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I'm glad you did." He looked up at her then, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you?" he asked softly. There was something in his tone, hesitation, maybe even doubt, that made her chest ache. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I am." They stood in silence for a long moment, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Finally, Lucas sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do, Gabrielle. I don't know how to fix this." Her heart clenched at the rawness in his voice. "I don't think there's an easy fix," she said quietly. "I wish there was." He nodded, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "I hate this," he admitted. "I hate feeling like I'm asking you to give up everything for me. But I hate even more the idea of walking away from you. It feels like no matter what we do, we lose." Gabrielle's breath hitched, and she blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. She stepped closer to him, her voice trembling as she said, "I don't want to lose you, Lucas, but I don't know how to make this work." He turned to face her, his expression pained. "Neither do I." For a moment, they just stood there staring at each other, the weight of their feelings pressing down on them. And then slowly, Lucas reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It wasn't much, not a kiss, not a promise, but it was something, a lifeline in the storm. Gabrielle held on, even as her heart twisted with the knowledge that the storm wasn't over yet. The storm outside was relentless, sheets of rain hammering against the windows and lightning splitting the sky with wild, jagged streaks. The power in the cafe had flickered twice already, the dim glow of the Edison bulbs waning momentarily before sputtering back to life. Gabrielle glanced nervously at Lucas, who was sitting across from her, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through a spreadsheet on his laptop. The glow of the screen lit his features, sharp and focused, but even he couldn't hide the tension creeping into his posture. "Do you think it's safe to stay here?" she asked, her voice soft but tight. She hated the way it trembled, revealing her unease. Lucas glanced up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "It's just a storm," he said, but his tone carried the same undercurrent of uncertainty that she felt. "We're fine. These old buildings are built to last." His attempt to sound reassuring didn't entirely convince her, or, judging by his quick glance out the window, himself. The cafe was almost empty now. Most of the other customers had cleared out when the rain started coming down harder, and the two baristas were busy stacking chairs, preparing to close early. Gabrielle's gut twisted uneasily, and she wrapped her hands around her chai latte, now lukewarm but still comforting in her palms. The wind howled against the windows again, a low, mournful sound that made her shiver. "We could just head out," she offered hesitantly, though the thought of stepping into the chaos outside made her pulse quicken. "I mean, we've gotten enough done for tonight, right?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, studying her. The corner of his mouth quirked up in a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're scared." She bristled instinctively, though she knew he was right. "No, I'm just being practical." "Uh-huh," he teased lightly, though his gaze stayed steady on hers. "Well, if you really want to go out there and wrestle with the wind and rain, be my guest, but I'd rather take my chances in here." Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, this time staying off. The cafe plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the room in startling bursts. Gabrielle's breath hitched, and she heard a soft curse from Lucas as he pushed his laptop aside. "Guess we're not finishing that budget tonight," he muttered. The baristas exchanged worried looks by the counter. One of them turned on the flashlight on her phone, its narrow beam casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. "We should probably close up," one of them called out nervously. "Storm's getting worse." Lucas turned back to Gabrielle, his face just barely visible in the dim light. "You okay?" His voice was softer now, the teasing gone. She nodded, though the truth was her chest felt tight, her nerves frayed. The storm, the darkness, the sudden isolation, it all felt too much. "I'm fine," she said, but even she didn't sound convincing. Lucas reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The simple gesture steadied her, and she let him take her hand fully, his grip warm and grounding. "We'll ride it out," he said quietly. "We're safer in here than out there." Before she could respond, a deafening crack split the air, followed by the groan of metal and wood. The building shuddered, and Gabrielle gasped, her free hand flying to the edge of the table as the ground seemed to shift beneath her. Above them, one of the iron beams creaked ominously, and a chunk of plaster fell from the ceiling, shattering on the floor just a few feet away. "Gabrielle, move!" Lucas's voice was sharp, urgent. He was already on his feet, tugging her up with him as another groan echoed through the building. She stumbled, her legs unsteady, but he steadied her, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist as he pulled her toward the corner of the room, away from the falling debris. The baristas shouted something, warnings or instructions, she couldn't tell, but the storm drowned out their words. Another crash reverberated through the cafe, and Gabrielle's heart pounded wildly as she clung to Lucas. The scent of rain, dust, and something acrid filled the air. "We need to," she started, but her voice broke as another beam gave way, collapsing with a deafening crash just a few feet from where they had been sitting moments before. The floor trembled beneath them, and the windows rattled violently as though they might shatter at any moment. Lucas's grip tightened. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but steady. "We'll find a way out. Just don't let go of me." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and clung to him as he guided her toward the far side of the room, away from the worst of the damage. The flashlight beam wavered as one of the baristas tried to illuminate the path, but it wasn't enough to cut through the chaos. Another loud crack, this one closer, made Gabrielle flinch, and she stumbled again, her legs shaking from fear. Lucas caught her, his hands firm on her arms as he steadied her. "Hey," he said, his voice suddenly gentle despite the noise around them. "You're okay, I've got you." Her eyes met his, wide and glassy, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten in a completely different way. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." "I know," he said, his hands framing her face now, his thumbs brushing against her cheeks. "But I'm not letting anything happen to you. You hear me?" She nodded, her breath hitching as tears pricked her eyes. Lucas, The words caught in her throat, too raw, too vulnerable to say. But he seemed to understand anyway. His gaze softened, and without thinking, he leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "We'll get through this," he murmured. "Together." In that moment, despite the chaos around them, despite the storm raging outside and the building threatening to collapse, she believed him. The ceiling groaned above them, the sound sharp and visceral, like the whole building was exhaling its last breath. Dust rained down in fine, suffocating clouds, and Gabrielle coughed, her throat raw as she clung to Lucas's arm. The café was barely recognizable now. Tables were overturned, plaster littered the floor, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt wood and ozone. Another beam cracked somewhere near the center of the room, and the sound reverberated through her chest like a warning bell. "We need to move." "Now," Lucas said, his voice taut but steady. His hand was wrapped tightly around hers, his grip grounding her as much as it propelled her forward. Gabrielle nodded, unable to find her voice, and followed his lead as he pulled her toward the back of the café. The front entrance was blocked by fallen debris, jagged shards of wood and metal crisscrossing like an impenetrable barricade. The storm outside screamed against the windows, the wind howling as if it wanted in. "This way," Lucas called, his voice cutting sharply through the chaos. He angled them toward the counter, where the baristas had already fled into the back storage area. His movements were quick, precise, but he kept glancing over his shoulder at her, his dark eyes scanning her face as though making sure she was still with him. Gabrielle's legs felt like jelly, her knees threatening to buckle with every step. "The back door," she gasped, finding her voice at last. "Through the kitchen." "Exactly," Lucas said, his hand tightening around hers. "We'll make it." They rounded the counter, ducking under a precarious shelf that groaned ominously as another tremor rippled through the building. The storm outside was deafening now, the rain hammering against the roof with brutal force. Gabrielle tripped on a fallen chair leg, and Lucas caught her mid-stumble, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist. "I've got you," he said, his voice low, steady. It wasn't just reassurance, it was a promise. She wanted to tell him she believed him, but another crack above them cut her off. Her breath hitched as a chunk of ceiling crashed down behind them, sending up a plume of dust and debris. The noise was deafening, and Gabrielle's heart raced as Lucas shoved her forward, shielding her with his body. "Go," he shouted, his voice raw. "We're almost there." The door to the kitchen loomed ahead, barely visible through the haze. Gabrielle pushed forward, her lungs burning with every step. When they finally reached the door, Lucas shoved it open with his shoulder, the force of the movement tearing the handle loose. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the faint, flickering glow of emergency signs. The air was colder here, the wind sneaking in through cracks and gaps, but it was a relief, proof that they were close to the outside. "There!" Gabrielle pointed to the back door, her voice breaking. Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a metal chair that had toppled against the door and shoved it aside, clearing the way. The handle was jammed, and, for a heart-stopping moment, Gabrielle thought they were trapped. But Lucas threw his weight against the door with a guttural sound of effort, and it burst open, slamming against the wall as icy rain lashed into the room. They stumbled outside together, the storm immediately swallowing them whole. The wind whipped at Gabrielle's hair, and rain pelted her skin like needles, but the relief of breathing open air was enough to make her knees weaken. She turned back toward the café just in time to see the roof sag inward with a sickening groan. A moment later, the entire structure caved in on itself, collapsing in a cacophony of splintering wood and shattering glass. Gabrielle gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God! Lucas's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close as they stood in the rain, staring at the ruins of what had so nearly been their tomb. She could feel him trembling, not from the cold but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his lips close to her ear to be heard over the storm. She turned to him, her face streaked with rain and dust, and nodded wordlessly. But she wasn't okay, not really. Her heart was still racing, her chest tight with the realization of how close they had come to disaster. Tears threatened to spill over, and her hands shook as she reached out, gripping his jacket. "Lucas." Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. "I thought I was going to lose you." His expression softened, and he cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing away the mixture of rain and tears on her cheeks. "You didn't," he murmured, his voice low but fierce. "You never will, not if I can help it." Gabrielle's breath hitched as she looked into his eyes, their usual teasing warmth replaced by something raw and unguarded. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice trembling, "not just of the storm, but of losing this, losing you." He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers in the cold, rain-soaked air. "We're not losing anything," he said, his tone resolute. "Not if we don't want to." For a moment, the storm seemed to fade around them, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Lucas's hands were warm against her face, his touch steady and sure. And in that moment, Gabrielle knew, truly knew, that whatever came next, she couldn't let fear hold her back anymore. "Together," she said softly, the word like a vow. "Together," Lucas echoed, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that tasted like rain and relief. The morning sun streamed through the narrow windows of the café's new location, the light catching on the freshly painted walls and rows of tiny chairs set neatly in a circle. Gabrielle stood in the middle of the room, her arms crossed over her chest as she took it all in. It didn't feel real yet, the soft hum of possibility, the smell of new beginnings, but it was real. It was hers. "Second home," Lucas said behind her, his voice warm with approval. She turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, his familiar grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's perfect, just like you imagined it." She smiled, a soft flush rising in her cheeks. "Not just me. You helped make this happen." Lucas pushed off the doorframe and crossed the room to her, his boots tapping softly against the polished floor. "It wouldn't have happened if you hadn't dreamed it first," he said, stopping just in front of her. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm glad I stayed." Her eyes searched his face, full of affection and gratitude. "You didn't have to. I would have understood. Seattle was your dream." "No," Lucas said, shaking his head. "You're my dream, Gabrielle. This is what feels right. The job, the city, none of it would have meant anything without you." He paused, his hand resting against her cheek. "We'll figure out the rest together." Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled instead, leaning into his touch. "Together," she echoed. He kissed her then, slow and certain, as the sunlight warmed their skin. And for the first time, Gabrielle didn't feel like she had to choose between her heart and her dreams. They were finally one and the same.